Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Justice, and it is my sincere pleasure to welcome you to our latest MHS webinar, Reimagining Gifted Identification, the Power of the GRS2. The Gifted Rating Scale, second edition, considered a second-generation diagnostic tool, is a parent and teacher-completed rating scale used to help the identification of gifted students. We are thrilled to have you all here today to learn more about the GRS2. But first, we would like to begin by telling you a bit about MHS. For over 40 years, MHS has provided trusted, data-driven solutions across our core disciplines: clinical, education, talent development, and public safety. Science and research are the basis of MHS's tools and future innovations. With advanced tool sets, we help clients evaluate, track, and leverage human-centric data to help realize their full potential. We are guided by a clearly articulated digital trust framework to ensure that the rights and privacy of our clients are always protected. We strive for fairness in the development and deployment of the products we make, the solutions we provide, and the people we lead. MHS Education continues to provide the expertise and resources required to support diverse needs of children and adolescents in and around the classroom. Now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephen Pfeiffer. Dr. Pfeiffer is a nationally and internationally recognized authority on gifted education, with a career dedicated to advancing how gifted students are identified and supported. After completing his postdoctoral training, Dr. Pfeiffer led Duke University's gifted program before joining Florida State University as Professor Emeritus. He is the lead author of the Gifted Rating Scale's first and second editions, widely used tools for identifying gifted and high-ability students across diverse educational settings. His pioneering work has helped educators and psychologists recognize the resiliency and social competency and cognitive needs of gifted children, shaping the best practices in schools and beyond. Dr. Pfeiffer's book, Essentials of Gifted Assessment, is considered the gold standard for gifted identification, offering practical guidance and research-based strategies that have influenced policies and practices worldwide. It's also worth checking out his most recent book, Parenting from the Heart: Raising Resilient and Successful Smart Kids, which provides invaluable insights for families. Before we begin, just a quick note: you'll receive an optional feedback survey at the end of the webinar. We'd love for you to share your thoughts and help us shape future events. Your feedback is always welcome. Now, over to Dr. Pfeiffer.
Hello, everyone, and particular thanks to Justice for that generous introduction. I'm delighted to be here today at the invitation of MHS to speak about some issues in gifted identification and the power of the new GRS2. So hold on, I'm going to move pretty quickly, and hopefully you'll find this informative and also maybe even a bit entertaining. I thought I would start with a brief warm-up activity. I know our time is limited, but it seemed important to set the tone for talking about the new GRS2 by sharing with you an example of a test item that we developed as part of the thousands of test items that we tried out in development of the GRS2. One of the scales that we initially piloted, my lab of doc students and I, was whether we could develop a sense of humor scale. In the literature, many have talked about high ability, high IQ students having a more rich, deeper sense of humor. And there's a lot of sort of hypotheses like this that have gone untested. Well, we decided to develop a measure of sense of humor to see if, in fact, well, we could measure humor, but also to see whether students with higher IQs have a better sense of humor. So this is an example of the kind of activity that we tried out with literally hundreds and hundreds of kids and adolescents across the country. The task is to create a funny caption for the picture. And then we had literally hundreds and hundreds of data sets to see whether there is a difference between high IQ kids and less high IQ kids in terms of sense of humor. So I'm going to leave it to you to try to come up with a real funny caption, and you can email it to me at spfeiffer@fsu.edu. And once I collect all the information, I'll share it with all the participants. So have fun with this warm-up activity as we move forward. As an introduction to the talk, I wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about the challenge of identifying high ability or gifted students. We know that there's a large number of very bright kids who go unidentified in the United States today. For example, just a few years ago, data suggested that over 40% of students in the United States are not identified as gifted. And the data is even more of more concern to students coming from lower income communities. So underidentification is a huge issue across the country and, in fact, internationally, and a particularly problematic situation for minoritized groups in the United States. This slide identifies two major contributing factors to underidentification in the United States. The first contributing factor is, as I'll talk a little bit about today, that there is a lack of consensus, even among authorities in the field, in how to define, conceptualize, and go about accurately identifying high ability students in the schools. So that's a big factor contributing to underidentification. And a second factor is that there are very few reliable or valid tools that measure students' potential and actual performance across multiple domains, which really was what was the impetus guiding, back in 2002, the initial development of the first GRS. I should add a third contributing factor. So if I could modify this slide, I would put the third factor is that within the education field and community in general, there is ambivalence about whether we should in fact be worrying about high ability gifted students or not. So that creates a tsunami of overreaction and pushback to those of us who are advocating for the unmet needs of high ability students, because many educators and administrators and fundraisers and politicians feel that these students have a leg up advantage anyway. Why do we need to worry about serving them in the schools? And with that viewpoint, you can see that there's going to be pushback to identification of high ability students. So there's a number of factors that clearly have contributed to underidentification of gifted students. I talk about a lack of consensus of who are these kids anyway. This slide reflects some of my writing in my 2015 book on assessment of the gifted, that there are multiple ways of viewing gifted children. Most of you are, I'm sure, familiar with the psychometric model, the model that speaks to high IQ as the defining feature of a gifted student. This goes back to Terman, and now it's over 100 years that this model has existed in the field, and it's very popular globally, not just in the United States. More recently, in the last 20 years or so, a second model that I'm a supporter of, the talent development model, presented itself on the scene. And there's a lot of research evidence supporting talent development model, and I'll talk about it in a second. The third model, a popular model, is the expert performance model. This model suggests that there's more than innate talent, more than just cognitive ability or IQ, that expert performance is the interface of considerable practice, specific coaching, and sustained effort or motivation, or in the field we call it grit. It's a popular model, a lot of research on this. One of my Dear colleagues at Florida State University, recently deceased Anders Ericsson is sort of the father of the expert performance model. And the final model on this slide is the multiple intelligences model. And most of you are probably familiar with Howard Gardner at Harvard University and his writing about multiple intelligences. This hasn't taken off in the United States as a popular approach to gifted identification, but in other countries, for example, in Chile and Brazil, it's sort of the guiding model that psychologists and educators work with. So lack of consensus, and there are many popular models that we can follow. Let me point out, and you probably remember from your theories of science class, that no one conceptualization is correct, that there are many different models and conceptions of what we mean by high ability, and they're essentially rated on how useful they are, not whether they're right or wrong. The model that I've been working with since the early 2001, 2002, when I was executive director at Duke's gifted program, was what we call the tripartite model of academic giftedness. And this has guided my work and my research in my lab at Duke and then subsequently at Florida State University. And a lot of my students who are now professors and researchers and administrators across the country have built upon that model. And we have a lot of research supporting its usefulness or utility in identification of gifted students. It goes beyond the prototype that you've all probably been exposed to, which is high IQ, the high IQ nerd. Well, the tripartite model looks more broadly at what we mean by high ability youngsters. So, as I said, I endorse a talent development model, and the tripartite model is a talent development model. And I came to this model sort of fortuitously in my experience on the sidelines as a parent watching one of my three kids, who was a very good athlete in middle school and high school and college, and the development of her expertise in soccer and lacrosse. And it helped me to think about bright kids in the classroom and the development that they progress through from preschool, kindergarten, through the early grades, up to high school and college. So what you can see in this picture is, in my model, we talk about 5 levels on the road towards what we mean as a gifted individual. We all start out as novices or beginners. We're exposed to opportunities in the home, in daycare and preschool and kindergarten, moving towards being competent. It might be in reading and mathematics, or in this instance, in soccer. From competence, though, with considerable additional work, coaching, feedback, practice, some kids can move from competent to excellent or expert in the field. And in fact, with continued work, they can move to an elite status and ultimately an eminent status. And we've validated this model now across a number of domains. For example, my students have done work with the development of clinical psychologists and their counseling skill, starting with day one of first day of graduate school, all the way through completing internship and postdoc working in the field. The idea that even bright graduate students start out as novice or beginner psychotherapists, they move towards being competent, working with a number of problems that they've had training and feedback on, but only a few move to the next level of expert, and it goes on to elite and eminent status. So the model applies to almost all complex human endeavors, and it guided our thinking about development of the GRS2. Okay, before I introduce the GRS2, and I get excited talking about the GRS2, but I have to remind myself to slow down. Let me cover very briefly what we mean by best practices in gifted identification. A few important considerations I'd like to share with you. I'm going to go through this rather quickly. A few years ago for APA, I gave 4-hour workshops on just best practices in gifted identification. So I'm condensing down from about 4 hours to about 5 minutes time. So hold on, we're going to be moving pretty quickly. Those of you interested in more details about this, you can find this in the GRS2 manual. There's a whole chapter that talks about this, as well as I reference my 2015 book on essentials of gifted assessment. Okay, so for this talk, I'd like to focus on 5 considerations that lead to best practices in specifically gifted assessment. And it started really with my work, clinical psychology. What do we mean by best practices in psychological assessment in general, be it assessment of clinical depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety disorder, specific learning disability, ADHD, the list goes on and on. Well, in Essentials of Gifted Assessment, I tried to articulate best practices in psychological assessment specific to gifted and talented students. So the 8 considerations I asked you to think about. 1, recognition that giftedness is not really something real in nature. It's essentially a hypothetical construct. It doesn't hold the same valence of reality that, say, clinical depression does, or bipolar disorder. It's essentially a hypothetical construct. And historically, experts said, well, maybe 128, 132 standard deviations above the mean on a test of cognitive ability demarcates gifted from not gifted. And that's an interesting an empirical point, but it still doesn't belie the fact that giftedness is a hypothetical construct. And Terman could have said 1 standard deviation above the mean, and for a generation, 2 generations of psychologists, we'd be operating at 1 standard deviation. Or he could have said 3 standard deviations. So essentially, there's no one correct point that demarcates gifted from not gifted, although we act as if there is. Second consideration is in all psychological assessment, including assessment of gifted and talented students, we should always encourage practitioners to use multiple measures. And this is real important, and why I point it out, because when I first came into the field, I saw that people were doing wholesale just assessment using an IQ screener, determining whether a student is gifted or not. And they held on to that label, gifted or not gifted, for 12 years of school. So we know in best practices in psychological assessment in general, multiple measures is always the way we should operate. It's true in medicine, it's true in neurology, and it's true in psychology. So you use multiple measures, not just the GRS2. Third point, which complements the second, is we always should operate using reliable and valid tests that were specifically developed for the purpose that they're intended and being used. Critically important. Fourth consideration is one that often gets neglected in the field, and that is that we should consider modifying or shifting, somewhat changing the test battery that we use when we embrace multiple measures based on the developmental status, the age of the child. It's not one test battery fits all. What we should use as assessment protocol for kindergarten and first graders, very different than students in middle school, very different than high school students applying to elite pre-college programs. So the test battery should shift with chronological age and developmental status. The fifth consideration is that the multiple criteria that we use as diagnosticians should also be flexible enough to be weighed based on the developmental status of the child. So for example, the original GRS was used as a screener in the New York City schools and we used a score on the GRS and a score on an IQ screener times two. So we did two weightings of the screener, and we came up with a rank ordering of all of the preschool and kindergarten students who were applying for gifted status in New York schools. Would have used a different weighting for fourth or fifth graders. IQ was more important in the kindergarten and first grade years than in fifth or sixth grade, where we'd want to give more weighting to academic performance. Sixth consideration is I encourage what I call a whole child approach, or assessing strengths of the heart and not just strengths of the head. Strengths of the head, cognitive abilities, creativity, problem solving, memory, those good things that we're all very familiar with in terms of intellectual prowess. A better approach, a more comprehensive and accurate approach, is a whole child approach where we also assess the child's heart strengths, compassion, understanding the feelings of others. These are things that are real important in understanding the whole child and not just their intellectual ability. Seventh consideration is local norms, particularly going back to the first consideration that we're talking about giftedness as a hypothetical construct. It's really not something real in nature. Local norms make the most sense because really what we're looking for in gifted assessment is which students would most benefit from specialized programs, resources, services to further facilitate these high ability students taking off and excelling to their high potential. Well, local norms is going to identify the top 2%, 5%, 10%, 15% in that local community who are going to be the most logical recipients for gifted programs and services. And the final consideration in best practices in gifted assessment is recurring assessment. When I first entered the field, it was test one time. If a child is gifted, they're gifted for their life. If they're not, well, they're not gifted. What we encourage is recurring assessment across multiple domains, essentially every second year. That would fit in with best practices in psychological assessment. All right, well, thank you for bearing with me in covering that academic topic. All right, a working definition of the gifted child or gifted student. And it's important, there's a nuance to this, so let me point it out. The definition I've been working with since my time at Duke University is that the gifted child demonstrates a greater likelihood when compared to other similar students of an opportunity to achieve extraordinary accomplishments in culturally valued domains. And the nuance in this definition is we're really talking about making a prediction with proper opportunity. The youngster who's identified as gifted is going to distinguish themselves in some culturally valued domain. So we're talking about future prediction. It makes it a little trickier in assessment, but really the same is true in all fields. When you think of when I was in the military, we were trying to identify prospective pilots to fly Navy jets. We're making some prediction about among the trainees who are the top 10% who are going to be our top flight pilots. Same is true in sports and in all academic fields. So the working definition of gifted child speaks to, with the same opportunity, making a prediction. Building on the legacy of the original GRS, which was first published in 2003, we know that the GRS has become the most widely used rating scale to identify gifted and talented students, both in the United States and internationally. It's quick and easy to administer, easy to score, it's intuitive, little training required, and most important, it's highly effective. It has really outstanding psychometric properties. Let me talk briefly about the GRS2 now. This is really one of the singular distinguishing factors about the GRS2. It provides multiple perspectives. Remember what I was talking about, the 8 important characteristics of high quality gifted assessment. Well, multiple perspectives is critically important. We've added a parent form, so the parent now perspective is taken into account in understanding a student's unique areas of strength and opportunities for growth and further development. So the new GRS2 parent scale has offered a huge contribution to the field in providing multiple perspectives on high ability students. So the GRS2 parent scale looks at 3 domains: cognitive ability, creative artistic ability, and the heart strengths I talk about and write about, resiliency and social competency. So students get rated by their mom or dad or guardian on cognitive ability, but also creative artistic ability and resiliency and social competency. Unique in the gifted field, and we think very, very valuable in getting a more complete picture of the student. The teacher form, on the other hand, has 6 scales. Intellectual ability, we're all familiar with that, but academic ability as distinguished from intellectual ability, artistic talent, creativity, motivation, and leadership. So we have 6 scaled scores from the teacher form and 3 scaled scores in the parent rating form. Much more comprehensive view or understanding of the student that we're assessing. The new GRS2 provides response style analysis, which is very, very cool. The user gets data on how many omitted items, the rater, the teacher, or the parent excluded. The rater also gets an inconsistency index score describing whether there was an inconsistent response pattern and whether there are identical ratings provided. Any of these are red flags that the user can use to determine whether there might be a problem with the rating. This slide provides you with a picture of just an illustrated gifted identification battery. And I selected the Naglieri Nonverbal Intelligence Test. Jack Naglieri, a good buddy of mine. I've included that. It's a great test. The Stanford Achievement Test, another really fine test that we've used in gifted identification. And of course, we included the GRS2. And as you can see, the GRS2 provides ratings on potential for academic success, acquired academic knowledge, and finally, multiple dimensions of gifted and talentedness. So in conjunction and marriage with the Naglieri Ability Scale and the Stanford Achievement Test, you have right here a comprehensive assessment protocol. Let's take a very quick look at GRS2 psychometrics. There's a ton of information in the GRS2 manual for those of you who really like to dig in and look at the psychometrics. And I encourage every user to carefully go through the manual because we've spent a lot of time making sure that the GRS2 works psychometrically. So we're very proud of it, but we know most users sort of skip through the psychometrics, but they're important. They're really important. So let me cut to the chase here and say that the new GRS2, teacher form and parent form, provide very strong psychometric evidence for reliability. The scores that one obtains are precise and consistent. Validity, the GRS2 is measuring what we want, what it purports and expects to be measured. And it also is darn fair. The scales are measuring the same construct for all groups based on race, ethnicity, gender, geographic location, parent education level. So we're talking about really impressive psychometric findings. So educators, psychologists, administrators can be confident and comfortable that the scores they're getting on students in their school are reliable, valid, and fair. So this slide, for example, shows internal consistency for the GRS2. What we're seeing here is extraordinarily high precision of the measure across the full range of traits that the GRS2 measures. Looking at retest reliability, we're getting really impressive, solid, and significant correlations between the parent rating, the teacher rating on the GRS2. The retest reliability, we tested over a 2 to 4 week window, and with substantial sample size, what we found a median correlation is very high. Inter-rater reliability, also very impressive. We were really pleased that different raters come up with consistently accurate scores on the GRS2 teacher and parent, all significant at the 0.001 level. Test fairness, an important construct for sure. So using sophisticated psychometric procedures, we measured invariance and differential test functioning. And what we found is the scale completed by the parents and the scale completed by the teacher are quite fair. There was little to no bias found in the factor structure between any groups that we included. The test is working. It's working as it's intended. And I can assure you there was a ton of revision, feedback, pruning, rewriting before we got to this point, that it was as precise an instrument as there exists in the gifted assessment field. Mean group differences were negligible for the teacher and parent forms. This depicts gender, very small differences between male and females. Again, small, negligible differences between students from different race and ethnicity, and small differences, small to medium differences, parent education level. We would expect some variance based on parent education level, which we got, but not to the point where it's not equally accurate for a student based on their parent education level. In undertaking the development of the new GRS2, we said we really want a Spanish translation of the parent form. And we took it upon ourselves to develop that, and it works beautifully well. And it's been used in multiple countries where Spanish is the primary language, and parents find it extraordinarily easy to complete. So we're proud of it. We're proud of what we put together. The resources here in this slide provide the history going back really to 2001 in the development of the first GRS and then the updated, newly developed GRS2. I hope you'll try out the scale if you haven't already. I hope you'll take the time to read the manual. We put a lot of time and effort to provide users with all of the information that you need to be confident that this scale works, that this scale is a good scale in identifying gifted and talented students in the schools, that administrators should feel competent and comfortable that they're using a highly successful instrument in working with students in their school district. Love to hear from you if you have any questions. Look forward to getting your suggested responses to the humorous pilot item that I put earlier in the talk. And I wish you a great school year, an academic year. Hope to hear from you and hope that you're finding the GRS2 useful in your academic and clinical work. Good speaking with you all.
Now on to our Q&A. Is the parent perspective / assessment completion required in order to generate actionable data or qualitative scores?
So the parent perspective, it's not required to generate actionable data or qualitative scores. So the teacher forms alone are sufficient to generate all of the scores that we typically give. So T-scores, percentiles, and any actionable insights for gifted identification. So we do recommend that you can use the parent form to gain an additional perspective, which is in line with best practices in gifted identification, but it's not necessary. If you do fill out the parent form, you'll just get multiple data points. So you got the teacher perspective and the parent perspective, which can help you in your gifted identification process, but everything has been psychometrically tested independently, so you can select any one of the three forms and independently run that, and it'll be valid and reliable.
Thank you for that. The next question that we received is, how are the norms created, and are they by age or grade?
Yep, so I guess that's also a question for me. The norms are by age. So we have stratified age bands for the different norm groups. And the only thing about grade is grade will determine which form you take. So for students who are age 6, that's the overlap of students who could be in preschool, kindergarten, or it could be in primary school. So grade will dictate which form they take, whether that's the teacher form, the teacher school form, or the teacher preschool, kindergarten form. But the actual norm data is by age.
Okay, that's great. The next question that I received is the cost of the GRS2 per student or as a package?
Absolutely. So the cost of the GRS2 is per use. So however many uses you administer for a student, you pay $5.50 per that use. And if you'd like more information on how to order, you can actually, I believe there's a QR code on the screen next to me right now that takes you to the storefront where you can get additional information about ordering, or if your school district happens to require a PO, I can connect you with your account executive for your area to help you get that PO generated. So just a little bit more about purchasing, but it is $5.50 per use.
Thank you so much. The next question I have is, I believe this one would be for Justin. Who should fill out the teacher form? Should it be the homeroom versus maybe the science teacher? Do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good question. We definitely been asked this before. So what we recommend is that the teacher who's most familiar with the student's abilities in that particular domain should complete the form. So generally speaking, for like elementary students, their homeroom teacher is often the most appropriate because they, observe the students across multiple subjects. But when we get into middle school, high school, we recommend, if possible, to give the particular subject teachers. So that could be like, the math teacher or the art or music teacher. Those ones might be better suited to rate those specific domains. And in the GRS2 teacher forms, there are different domains. So like the creativity aspect, that might be, something that the music teacher might hone in more than the math teacher. The math teacher might, be more suited to rate cognitive ability. So we recommend selecting the teacher that knows that student's ability the best and getting those multiple perspectives so that we can get a more holistic view of the student's ability and potential.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. The next question I have here is, how can I access the GRS2 manual that was mentioned in the webinar?
I can also answer that question. So the manual is fully online. So once you purchase GRS2, then in your package, you'll get an online access to the manual. So you can, search, you can look at all the psychometric data, norm samples, and get best practice use for that. So it's completely available online once you purchase the GRS2.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you so much. We also got this question. What is the difference between the forms? Do the teacher forms have different scales or items?
Yeah, so another good question. So there are 5 scales on the preschool form, and those same 5 scales are available on the teacher school form. But the only difference in terms of scales is that the school form has the leadership scale. So that'll ask, to give ratings on different aspects about leadership. It's not really appropriate to ask so much for the younger students, so that's why we omitted that one. There are a little bit of overlap in some of the items, but because, we're talking about two different populations, like the kindergarten versus the school age, the actual items are more geared towards each specific one. So they are pretty specific. That's why we recommend, even with the age 6 students, if they're in elementary school, to use the school form. If they're in kindergarten, to use the kindergarten form, because it's more suitable in that way. And then the parent form, as Dr. Pfeiffer already pointed out, has 3 completely different scales. And the reason being is that parents see the student in a completely different context. At home, students can act one way, whereas at school they can act completely different. So we really wanted to give, as we keep saying, that holistic approach, so that we can see those different things. And that's why the scales differ a lot more between the parent and the teacher. But great question.
Thank you. Yeah, that was great. So there is another question about the forms. They're asking, how does the parent complete the form? Is it a link to an electronic form, or is it a hard copy? Can you
Good question. So it's actually both. So we offer the GRS2 completely available, like electronically, so you can take it online. That's easy for most people, but we do know, some people may not have access to a computer they can always use, or a smartphone or something like that. So we do allow for hard copies that, that can be printed off at your library or something like that and then filled out. So if you prefer to go the hard copy route, that's totally available. But electronic forms are available too. So it's really up to your preference.
Oh, that's great. The last question that I'm seeing here is, what would happen if 2 teachers rated a student but got different results?
Yeah, another great question. So this kind of brings back to that earlier question, where I was saying that, you might get your music teacher to speak more about your artistic ability, and your math teacher might speak more about the student's cognitive ability. And it's totally fair and reasonable that people have different perspectives. So, a student might accelerate in one aspect and maybe not the others as much. There could even be, 2 math teachers that are rating the same student, and they view them differently. One might rate them higher on cognitive ability than the other. So it's normal to see differences between different raters, because everyone has different perspectives. But it's important to remember that using the GRS2 is just one data point in the entire gifted assessment package. So you shouldn't just rely on one data point to determine whether a student should enter a gifted program or not. You should be taking multiple data points. So if one teacher's rating scores suggest that the student is likely gifted, you should then explore that further, using other assessments and other ways to identify the giftedness. You shouldn't just take this as an absolute truth. So it's totally reasonable to expect differences between different teachers and the different scales. But great question.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. I have a follow-up question from earlier. Is the teacher form able to be passed around to multiple teachers to complete, to hone in on specific skills for an older student?
Yes. Within different, so each scale has, for the teacher forms, has 10 items. So we don't recommend that you would split up a scale. Like, let's say you're looking at the cognitive ability scale. We don't recommend that you would have one teacher take 4 items and then another teacher take the 6. We don't recommend that. What we would recommend, if they want to rate the same scale, is to just do it twice. So one teacher would answer the cognitive ability rating items independently of the other one, so they would do it twice. Or in the case of, a teacher might not be able to speak on artistic ability, then that, like I was giving the example with the music teacher might just only fill out that one scale, and then the other teacher would fill out the other scales. So as long as one teacher is rating all the items on a scale, that's totally fine to pass along, and we actually do recommend that, but we don't recommend splitting a scale between different raters.
Okay, I see. Thank you. Do the tests take into account Dabrowski's theory of overexcitability in gifted children? This means that gifted children often exhibit extreme responses in areas of emotional, intellectual, sensory, psychomotor, and imaginative development. You may observe this in gifted children who frequently experience emotional meltdowns, have strong emotional responses, and exhibit powerful emotions, as well as being easily stimulated by sensory stimuli. Well, that was a mouthful.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't have a solid 100% answer off the bat, but if you want to send me an email, we can totally dig into that. I will say there are items that speak to some aspects of that. Yeah, I don't know if it would be 100% what you're looking for, but there are definitely items that, you know, speak to that realm of, or that domain, I should say. So yeah, why don't you send me an email and we can further up on that conversation.
Thank you so much for all those wonderful questions, everybody. I'm not receiving any more questions, so I just want to say thank you again to Dr. Pfeiffer for the informative presentation today. I'd also like to thank all our attendees who joined today. If we didn't get to your question in this webinar, please send us an email at marketing@mhs.com and we'll forward your questions along to Dr. Pfeiffer or a member of our staff at MHS. As a reminder, you will receive a copy of the webinar recording in a few weeks. Thank you so much.